You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Warning: the content of this episode may be emotionally challenging, as it contains frank discussion of suicide and mental health struggles, which some may find distressing. If you or someone you know is struggling, help is available. In the U.S., just dial 988 on your phone for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. In the admittedly long cold open of my episode on Hypatia of Alexandria, in my polemic against Trump, focusing on his misogyny and material harm of women, I mentioned that women are among the first victims of authoritarianism. And I think that is a good place to start in this episode, which will be looking specifically at the persecution of individuals during the Third Reich in Nazi Germany. Here we have an apt example of the sort of misogyny and persecution of women that I asserted we're seeing today in the US under the Trump regime. I suggested that what we see today foreshadows the suffering of women under Christian nationalism and may give us the sense that we're moving toward the Christo-fascist Republic of Gilead of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, in which women are dehumanized, subjugated, and reduced to sexual servitude as reproductive slaves. And it should say something that, as much as that speculative fiction seems to be a cautionary tale about the direction America is headed, it very clearly depicts in many ways what it was like for women under Hitler's regime. First of all, though some will argue that Nazism, with all its occult obsessions, was anti-Christian, in large part Christianity was co-opted by the Nazis, and a particular brand of Christian nationalism that developed in Germany in the 1920s, right alongside Nazism, called the Deutsche Christen or German Christian movement, embraced the same nationalism and racism that drove Hitler's party. So, while it is certainly fair to say Nazism was not Christian, it certainly was Christian nationalist. And as we are disturbed by the idea of women's fate in a society like the one depicted in The Handmaid's Tale, and struggle to understand whether or how such a dystopia could really come to pass in the United States, it's worthwhile to think back on the fate of women in Germany, who went from enjoying political empowerment and progressive rights in the Weimar Republic to being reduced to mere breeders under the Nazis, all within the span of about a decade. The equality of women before the law and in domestic partnerships was written into the Weimar Constitution, Article 109, ratified in 1919. They were granted the right to vote and stand for election before such rights were extended to American women, and they represented about 10% of the representatives in the Reichstag that year. Women in Weimar Germany enjoyed access to higher education and established careers in growing numbers across a variety of fields. Along with these strides came further freedoms owing to their growing financial independence, such as sexual liberation. The new Frau or new woman was born, a strong and confident modern woman who wore her hair short, enjoyed greater liberties with her fashion, and acquired body autonomy, not just in regards to who she slept with, but also in regard to her reproductive rights. Better sexual education led to better access to contraceptives and even limited access to abortion, which offered the new woman more options and better lives. Certainly this women's liberation was one element among many that drove reactionaries into the corruptive arms of the nationalist German Christian movement and the Nazis, who promised to restore not only the German economy, their national dignity and racial purity, but also the social order, which many believed had degraded with these progressive reforms. Under Nazism, just as in the fictional Republic of Gilead, a declining birth rate was a cause of major concern. And in order to shore up the numbers, not just of their population generally, but of the so-called Aryan race specifically, meaning only white, Germanic, and Nordic people, they instituted a eugenics program called Lebensborn, or Fount of Life, which essentially sought to turn German women into breeding livestock. More and more, they pushed women out of the workplace, suggesting that the woman's sphere should be comprised only of Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. And the best breeders who gave the fatherland many children were awarded with medals, effectively making a contest of who could birth the most German babies. With these repressions of women came some closely related repressions of the LGBTQ community, which likewise had grown and come to enjoy uncharacteristic freedoms in the Weimar years. Behind all of it was a toxic masculinity that sought not only the control of women, but also to stamp out and discourage effeminacy in men, which was seen as contributing to the declining birth rate. This meant policing sexuality and also gender, leading to the genocide within a genocide, the gay and transgender victims of the Holocaust. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and ahead of International Trans Visibility Day, I want to once again look at the true stories of some transgender figures in history as proof positive of trans existence to better understand trans experience, and in this case also to shine a light on the long history of fascist persecution of trans communities. Thank you for listening to Under the Pink Triangle, Transgender Experience in Interwar Germany. Before we begin, I want to thank my newest patron, C. Thanks to all my patrons. I love researching and writing this program. I'm proud of it and I find it fulfilling, but it's still the financial support of you patrons, far more than the meager ad revenue I bring in, that makes it possible for me to devote as much time as I do to the podcast. Patrons of the show get access to an exclusive RSS feed with ad-free versions of the show, early release of episodes, teasers, and exclusive minisodes between every main release, making this a weekly podcast for patrons. If you hear minisodes and think they're little blurbs or insubstantial sound bites, think again. They're fully researched and produced episodes, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes long, and they tie in with the main episode topics. And they even sometimes fill in the gaps and tell the rest of the story that my main episode didn't have time to tell. For example, after my episode on the racism behind gun rights and gun control laws, historically, I released a minisode about the history of the Black Panthers and the FBI's COINTELPRO campaign to destroy them, including the murder of Fred Hampton. And after my episode on Hypatia of Alexandria, I released a minisode about the claims of widespread, systematic persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire and how scholars now consider this a myth. For listeners who are interested, I also sell these exclusive minisodes for just $3 a pop. So head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider purchasing the occasional blind spot minisode that interests you, or supporting the podcast for as little as $1 a month. Now, let's continue the episode. Welcome to Historical Blindness. To discuss the transgender experience in Germany, both before and after the Nazi takeover, we must first learn about the man who helped the trans community take such progressive strides, whose work would afterward be destroyed by Hitler. That man was Magnus Hirschfeld. A Polish Jew and son of a physician, Magnus Hirschfeld grew up in a conservative Prussian town where heteronormativity, under the German term normal sexuell, was the reigning social expectation. Nevertheless, he realized his own attraction to the same sex at a young age, and he took encouragement in ancient texts, specifically Greek works, that revealed the possibility of same-sex attraction being accepted in some ancient cultures. Likely due to these interests, his early studies were in comparative linguistics, but in his 20s, he followed in his father's footsteps and began to study medicine. In this field, he was confronted by the awful bigotry and unscientific misinformation about LGBTQ people when, during a lesson on quote-unquote sexual degeneracy, his instructor had a gay man who had been institutionalized for his sexuality for 3 decades marched in front of the class, nude, to be examined like some sort of subhuman curiosity. After earning his medical license, Hirschfeld traveled, and during those wanderings, which included a trip to the US during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago and visits to the bathhouses in Tangier, he encountered and began his studies of gay subcultures, which he found to be common and to share many commonalities, regardless of cultural setting. Starting his own practice back in Germany, his interest in the topic and his connection to the community led him to take on a number of gay and genderqueer patients. And one of the first things that struck him was how many of them bore the scars of suicide attempts. During these years, Hirschfeld was also greatly troubled by the news out of England of famous playwright Oscar Wilde's sodomy trials, which dragged his private life into the spotlight and ended in his being imprisoned for his sexual orientation. One night in 1896, Hirschfeld encountered a soldier who felt terrible shame and guilt over his sexuality and pleaded for a consultation. Hirschfeld sent the man away, telling him to visit his practice the next day, but the soldier killed himself that night and addressed his suicide letter to Dr. Hirschfeld, which he ended with the entreaty, quote, "The thought that you, Hirschfeld, could contribute to a future when the German fatherland will think of us in more just terms sweetens the hour of my death," end quote. From that day onward, Hirschfeld dedicated himself even more to the betterment of LGBTQ people, setting himself the explicit goal of fighting for the repeal of paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, which criminalized same-sex relations, and seeking an end to Germany's hostility toward the LGBTQ community there. During his studies, Magnus Hirschfeld took a special interest in the sex reformer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs, whose work would inspire many other pioneers in sexology, like Hirschfeld. Ulrichs was among the first to categorize sexual orientation, coining terms for men and women who felt same-sex attraction, and the way Ulrichs discussed it planted the seeds for understanding gender variance. While Ulrichs largely conflated sex and gender, suggesting that gay men must have some feminine interior identity and gay women likewise must have some masculine aspect of their minds or souls, his description of them as being quote-unquote intersexuals, or as he described a gay man, a quote female soul confined within a male body, end quote, problematic as this may be today, raised the notion then in the 19th century of what we would today recognize as the transgender experience. Hirschfeld's study in the nascent field of endocrinology would also provide some direction as he came to recognize gender variance and help what we would today call transgender people. In the mid-19th century, the study of hormones began with the work of Arnold Berthold, who discovered the effects of testicular secretions from his study of roosters and capons. It had been a practice since Roman times to remove a chick's gonads, thereby turning them into a capon, which takes on the physical aspects of a hen. It was not understood how that might be until Berthold removed the gonads and re-implanted them in the belly and observed that the bird still developed as a rooster. This was the first step toward the understanding of the endocrine system. And to Hirschfeld, it was also the first step in understanding gender variance and sexuality. While his understanding was still rudimentary, this science led him to the very admirable conclusion that diverse expressions of sexuality and gender variance were not quote-unquote degeneracy, as had been taught in his medical school, but rather were natural, and therefore, as he liked to say in his fight for LGBTQ rights, quoting Friedrich Nietzsche, quote, "What is natural cannot be immoral," end quote. This was the basis of his efforts to overturn paragraph 175, for which purpose he organized the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which gathered signatures in support of the reform from such luminaries as Leo Tolstoy, Emil Zola, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, Heinrich Mann, Max Brod, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and even Albert Einstein. Some in his community, however, parted ways with him over his theory of quote-unquote sexual intermediaries, which was essentially a spectrum as we understand sexual attraction and gender identity to be today. While he was not successful in getting paragraph 175 repealed, his efforts likely contributed to the gradual liberalization of German society, culminating in the founding of the Weimar Republic in 1919. That same year, he founded his Institute for Sexual Science, right near the Reichstag. At this medical institute, opened inside a beautiful Berlin villa, Magnus Hirschfeld would pioneer gender-affirming healthcare, providing both hormone therapy and even gender-affirming surgeries for transgender individuals, and engaging in advocacy for their humanity, the natural quality of their gender identity, and an end to hostility against them. His work contributed to the establishment of a thriving transgender community in Berlin. We must understand Hirschfeld's advocacy of transgender rights through his advocacy of the entire LGBTQ community, which he viewed as one continuum, with each quote-unquote sexual intermediary ranging in varying degrees from masculine to feminine, according not only to biological sex but also to gender expression and sexual orientation. Hirschfeld's conception was light years beyond the common understanding of his day, which considered sex binary and determinative of gender, and viewed sexual orientation in terms of a similar norm/deviance binary. Hirschfeld considered anatomy and gender identity separately, and considered sexual orientation as an additional variable rather than as determinative. But he was still rather caught in conceptions of what was considered masculine and feminine, claiming that men were assertive and dominant while women were passive and responsive, and from that, categorizing any sexual behavior or gender expression that deviated as metatropism, essentially a kind of reversal of gender roles, which was not far off from the dominant view of transgressive sexual behavior and gender expression as quote-unquote sexual inversion. But Hirschfeld's understanding of sex and gender was decidedly ahead of its time. He not only differentiated hetero from homosexual orientations, but also recognized bisexuality and even those with no apparent sexual desire, whom we might today identify as asexual. He recognized intersex biological features, acknowledging that biological sex, too, was neither binary nor absolute. And then there was his study and recognition of gender expression. Hirschfeld coined the term transvestism, although the concept of cross-dressing was well known at the time. To be clear, today the term transvestite is outmoded and considered derogatory. It's understood to refer to cross-dressing, which today is understood very differently. Cross-dressing, we recognize today, does not determine or infer anything about sexual orientation or gender identity. A cross-dresser may wear clothing traditionally reserved for the opposite gender for artistic or theatrical purposes, as in the case of drag performers, and the tradition of cross-dressing performers in the theater stretches all the way back to ancient Greece, as many cultures barred women from the stage, requiring that men play roles of every gender. Additionally, we understand today that cross-dressing may provide sexual gratification, regardless of orientation, and it also may provide stress relief and psychological comfort, or even just represent a bold fashion choice. But back in interwar Germany, cross-dressing was considered a crime, largely because of the cross-dressing of gay prostitutes, some of whom engaged in blackmailing their clients. Therefore, when they didn't pass well enough to go unnoticed, of course, cross-dressers and trans individuals were arrested and prosecuted under quote-unquote public decency laws for charges such as creating a public nuisance and quote-unquote gross mischief, end quote, facing steep fines and imprisonment for up to 6 weeks. What's so groundbreaking and heroic about Hirschfeld's recognition of quote-unquote transvestites is that he differentiated those who cross-dressed for other reasons from those who had a genuine, quote, drive for sexual transformation, end quote. And for this reason, his conception of transvestism is today largely considered a recognition of transgender people. Now for a brief intermission.
If you're a QuickBooks customer looking to grow your business without the growing pains, you need the Intuit ERP. Upgrade to Intuit Enterprise Suite in a matter of hours. It's the AI-native ERP from the makers of QuickBooks. Learn more at intuit.com/ERP.
Adobe Acrobat Studio, your new foundation. Use PDF spaces to generate a presentation. Grab your docs, your permits, your moves. AI levels up your pitch, gets it in a groove. Choose a template with your timeless cool. Come on now, let's flex those tools. Draft, design, deliver, make it sing. AI builds the deck so you can build that thing. Do that, do that, do that with Acrobat. Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-Acrobat.
Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teen accounts.
Now, back to the show. As with his advocacy against paragraph 175 and the criminalization of homosexuality, Hirschfeld focused a lot of his efforts on decriminalizing quote-unquote transvestism. And he did this specifically by endeavoring to prove that many who engaged in cross-dressing were not up to no good, but were rather expressing a deeply held gender identity. He was able to convincingly demonstrate this through the use of personal narratives, allowing quote-unquote transvestites to tell their own stories and explain their gender expression. The stories of 2 of Hirschfeld's patients should help to illustrate. Dora Richter, assigned male at birth, was born in a small town in the Ore Mountains. She behaved in a feminine manner and identified as a girl from a very young age, and was even caught at 6 years old attempting to remove her penis with a tourniquet. Contrary to dominant views then, and also persistent claims today, her narrative proves that transgender identity is not a social contagion, as Dora was very much alone in the bohemian mountain town of her childhood, believing herself utterly different. Some 10 years later in Berlin, another eventual patient of Hirschfeld's was born, Gerd R., who would later report that she was drawn to her sister's dolls and to girls' clothing from a young age. Neither Dora nor Gerd were supported in their gender identities by their families, and indeed, Gerd's narrative describes a lifelong enmity between herself and her mother, who throughout her life living as a woman would out her and get her fired from her jobs. Gerd actually tried to live as a man for some time, but found it impossible. Her features being so feminine, she found that on the street and in the workplace, she was frequently accused of being a woman wearing man's clothes, or of being a homosexual, a quote-unquote 175er, she was called, in reference to the anti-gay law. Therefore, she found that she had to express her gender identity as a woman just for her own safety. Both Dora and Gerd eventually found themselves living and traveling with performers, Dora with a theater troupe and Gerd with a trapeze act, as these were the only communities in which they could live safely as women, a gender identity that was central to their mental health. In cases like these, of quote-unquote psychic hermaphrodism, Hirschfeld argued that an exception must be made, and he succeeded in winning transgender individuals a quote-unquote transvestite certificate, essentially a license to live according to their gender identity without fear of arrest. Moreover, in arguing that dressing and living according to their gender identities actually helped these individuals achieve a quote-unquote mental equilibrium, and therefore prevented their becoming the public nuisance that the law criminalized, he successfully won them the right to legal name changes. It remained illegal for individuals to change their name to a name generally associated with a gender other than the one they were assigned at birth. But a judge did find a loophole that allowed these transgender people to change their names to a gender-neutral alternative name. And so the stage was set for a renaissance of transgender life in the German Weimar Republic. With Hirschfeld's scientific and medical work and his LGBTQ advocacy as foundation, a massive LGBTQ rights movement grew in Berlin and other big German cities, spearheaded by a number of organizations, including the League of Human Rights and the German Friendship Association, which was closely tied to Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. Then came the organizations fighting explicitly for transgender rights, the Coalition of Transvestites, the Special Transvestite Group, and the Dion organization, which met at Hirschfeld's Institute and took its name from the Chevalier Dion, a historical transgender figure that I did a whole episode about some years ago. Check that one out. The trans rights advocates in these organizations recognized the importance of their work, expressing their goals to be, in the case of the coalition, not just to, quote, fight against public opinion, end quote, but more importantly to, quote, save the lives and health of the lonely and desperate, end quote. These activists, many of whom were trans themselves, some publicly and others still closeted, recognized that this was a matter of life or death for trans individuals, a truth that many today still deny or minimize. Their fight for trans rights resulted in more open trans communities. Berlin's LGBTQ nightlife exploded with all kinds of LGBTQ clubs and cabarets, many of which featured drag and trans performers, like the El Dorado, the establishment that served as the inspiration of the famous musical Cabaret. Then there were the media outlets, long-running columns in newspapers and regular supplements in established magazines, which discussed the latest legal affairs and medical breakthroughs, offered opinions on social injustices, gave advice on dating and fashion, and shared short memoirs along with poetry and fiction, all aimed at a growing trans audience. Eventually, late in the Weimar Republic period, there was even a periodical dedicated especially to this trans readership called The Third Sex. But the hub of this growing community, the heart of the movement, and the driving force behind all the progress seen in LGBTQ rights and quality of life was Hirschfeld's Institute. This beautiful and expansive villa was more than just a sex clinic or a research facility. Among its wings were departments devoted to psychology and counseling, as well as ethnological studies. It housed a museum, a vast library, and a lecture hall, the place was a home away from home to many in the LGBTQ community of Berlin, who worked there, attended sex education lectures there, accessed contraceptives there, and received free advice and medical treatment. And it was even actually home to some, as there was even a residential wing, providing refuge to some very vulnerable people. Some few transgender individuals even received Hirschfeld's experimental hormone therapy there, feminizing only, as testosterone had not yet been synthesized, and even early sex change operations. Although trans women had performed self-castration since antiquity, Dora Richter was the first to undergo a gender reassignment surgery resembling those conducted today. Thus, Magnus Hirschfeld had done his utmost to live up to the charge given him by that patient in his suicide letter, to contribute to a future when Germany would think of the LGBTQ community in more just terms. And it made him public enemy number one to the Nazis. With the groundswell of nationalism and fascism in the 1920s, the German far right came to view the sex and gender progressivism of the Weimar Republic as one among several reasons to hate the status quo of the young liberal democracy. So Magnus Hirschfeld became a target. In 1920, he was brutally beaten by a mob of Völkisch agitators, an ethno-nationalist movement that fed right into Nazism. Unsurprisingly, since at its heart, Nazism was a retrogressive, reactionary movement that perceived the modern changes of society as decadent and corrupt, and therefore seeking a return to some former sociocultural norms, they came to view sex and gender progressivism as a major symptom of modern decay, and they moved against it. And of course, Hirschfeld's Jewish heritage fed right into Nazi conspiracism that the Jews were the corruptive influence behind it all. Hitler is often quoted as calling Hirschfeld, quote, the world's most dangerous Jew, end quote, or, quote, the most dangerous Jew in Germany, end quote, though I can't seem to find any reliable citation or source for this. But regardless of whether he said that, he certainly must have agreed with the sentiment and certainly encouraged violence against the community. Within 4 months of his being appointed chancellor, a mob of Nazi-sympathizing university students stormed the institute, chanting, "Burn Hirschfeld." They assaulted any occupants of its buildings that they could find and did extensive property damage. Then, as if not satisfied by the student attack, that same afternoon, Hitler's very own brown shirt stormtroopers, the SA, marched on the institute and removed all the contents of his extensive library. That evening, Berlin police declared that the institute was closed permanently. 4 days later, all the contents of the library were burned in the first major Nazi book burning at Bebelplatz Public Square, with Joseph Goebbels calling it, quote, intellectual filth, end quote, and shouting at the frenzied crowd, quote, no to decadence and moral corruption, yes to decency and morality in family and state, end quote. Hirschfeld, who was traveling at the time, never returned to Germany. Under the Nazi regime, the LGBTQ cabarets were shuttered and all publications devoted to the community ceased publishing. At the same time, they began to target Jewish immigrants and refugees with discriminatory laws. So, immediately upon taking power, the Nazis began a systematic persecution of both transgender people and immigrants. Does that sound at all familiar? Hitler started his repression against those who were most vulnerable, those whom few would stand up to defend. And even many gay men participated in these persecutions, certain that as long as they conformed to the brand of outward masculinity and nationalist fervor the regime demanded, they themselves would be safe. Indeed, the leader of Hitler's brown shirts, Ernst Röhm, was himself gay, as were other leaders of the SA. But about a year after the burning of the Hirschfeld library contents, during the Night of the Long Knives, the Nazis worked to purge homosexuality from their own ranks as well. And as enforcement of paragraph 175 intensified, transgender individuals were frequently prosecuted under laws that did not actually apply to them. In 1936, after the Nazi Lebensborn program to raise the birth rate was commenced, a Reich Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion was established, and this body took over the licensing of transvestism. In many cases, trans and gay individuals were imprisoned or made to wear the badge of the pink triangle and sent to concentration camps where they were castrated and died. To return to the topic of the motivation behind Nazi persecution of LGBTQ people, part of it was certainly their desire to increase the birth rate, which meant those unlikely to be generatively productive and who might, in their view, pervert their children into becoming likewise unproductive were deemed undesirable and worth purging. However, there was certainly the further element of toxic masculinity, of men feeling threatened by sexual and gender variance. And that is demonstrated by the fact that lesbians and trans men were largely treated differently from gay men and trans women, perhaps because it was thought that as owners of wombs they could still be made to bear children despite their sexual preferences and gender identity, or perhaps because they displayed the masculine traits and aspect the Nazis so admired. Later, trans people were often simply labeled work-shy or antisocial and sent to forced labor camps wearing a black triangle badge, lumped in with criminals and the disabled, for no better reason than that they did not conform with the Nazi regime's notions of perfection. The experience of Gerd R. is, I think, very instructive in better understanding the contradictions and double standards of the Nazi persecution of trans people. Certainly, Gerd being a person assigned male at birth who dressed and lived as a woman was enough to have her carted off to a concentration camp. And indeed, she did end up, for a time, in Sachsenhausen camp. But there were other aspects that complicated her treatment by Nazi authorities. First, she was quote-unquote Aryan, which of course worked in her favor. Second, she was skilled as a draftswoman, which made her labor valuable. And third, and perhaps most importantly, she was attracted to women, had married a woman named Gertrude, and the two had had 2 sons together. This meant then that Gerd could produce little white boys for the Nazi state to corrupt and turn into little Hitler youth, which made her valuable despite her nature. Therefore, she was released from the camp, but forced by the Gestapo to detransition. They cut her hair, rescinded her name change back to her dead name, Walter, and required her to wear the men's clothes that had never really fit her. During this time, her wife Gertrude left her, her hateful mother conspired to take her sons away, and she sank deep into depression and masochism. In 1938, she was arrested again for continuing to cross-dress. At her trial, she made an impassioned plea, stating, quote, "I believe I can only be seen as a full human being in women's clothes," end quote. Despite doctors' assessments of her quote-unquote transvestism affirming that allowing the expression of her gender identity was integral to her mental health, she was institutionalized at a sanatorium, where she eventually hanged herself. I think that today we must take numerous lessons from this history. First, that trans experience is undeniably real, that it is not a social contagion. There is strong scientific basis and simple human reason for understanding it as natural and not as harmful or contagious or morally objectionable. That the hate and hostility of not only society at large but especially of close family members, as was the case with Gerd's mother, has a devastating effect on transgender people who can only be saved from tragedy with understanding, support, and gender-affirming care. That gender identity is entirely divorced from biological sex and from sexual orientation. That as human beings, every trans person is different, and that it is not uncommon for an authoritarian and specifically a fascist regime to target the trans community as a threat for no better reason than that they want to establish control. And there's no better way to do that than by targeting vulnerable groups, defining them as an outgroup, scapegoating them for the supposed decline of a nation, dehumanizing them, and then overseeing their systematic persecution and sometimes genocide. These lessons are of the greatest importance today. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. As always, special thanks go out to my partner patrons, Diane Lane, Joe Escott, Devlin Hoff, Lisa, Prickly Pear, Fred R. Grotice, Robin Naggett, Don Mundus, Eunice Allen Bradley, Juliette O'Connor, Jonathan Williams, Joshua Luddington, Christine LeBlanc, Lonnie C., Kaylee, Ama, Christopher L. Burton, Benny Slater, Chris BDG, Jocelyn Clausen, Lindsay McAllister, Brian, Jamie Nielsen, Martin Robistow, Josh Haberman, and AJ. If you patrons haven't heard them, go check out my 2021 episode, The Story of Chevalier Dion and the Inadequacy of the Historical Analysis of Transgender Identity, and last year's episode, Empress Elagabalus. And if you're interested in more trans history, check out NPR's All the Only Ones, about trans youth in American history, and the Translash podcast with Imara Jones, a show that tells trans stories to save trans lives. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows, like The Constant and Who Did What Now. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel, licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution license. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember the poem First They Came, written by a German Lutheran pastor who had supported the anti-socialist and anti-Semitic campaigns of the Nazis until such time as the Nazis placed themselves above the church. It details all the persecutions that he did not speak out about because they didn't affect him, against the communists, socialists, trade unionists, and Jews, until there was no one left to speak out when they came for him. It may as well read today, quote, "First they came for the transgender people, and I did not speak out, because I was not trans."
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
What did it take to survive an ancient siege?
Why was the cult of Dionysus behind so many slave revolts in ancient Rome?
What's the tragic history and mythology behind Japan's most haunted ancient forest?
We're Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl. Join us to explore ancient history and mythology from a fun, sometimes tipsy perspective.
Find us at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or wherever you get your podcasts.